see the moon sees me. Down through the leaves of the old oak tree.
The vehicle's not safe.
We need to fail. We need to fail down here so we don't fail up there.
Please let the light that shines on me
Neil, everyone's in agreement. We'd like you to command.
shine on the one I love.
Welcome to the Film Board from the Next Reel on rashpixel.fm. We spoil movies. And on tonight's show, each one of our gang of thugs tried to be first in line to see First Man in our local theaters. And right here, right now, we're going to be the first to spoil it for you. Well, other than the fact that it's a movie about something that happened in real life, so you may already know the story. Well, I thought I knew the story, but there was so much more detail in this thing that we just saw. It gets into about Neil Armstrong and the winding, difficult path that led him to lead our moonshot. Let's introduce our hosts so that we can launch into this. Say hello, Steve Sarmento.
In space, no one can hear you mourn the death of your child.
Oh,
Oh my God!
wow.
Out of the gate, that is phenomenal.
Okay. So that's Steve Sarmento, everyone. How about you, Pete Wright?
Buzz Aldrin. More like Buzz Kill. Am I right? Huh?
Nice.
I'm with you on that. And I like where this is going. Hello, Tommy Handsome.
Yeah, a spaceship can't undress a boy. Folks, that's from Child 44, an old episode you haven't listened to and will not go back to. But I'm not a creep. That's a callback. All right.
We are going to have to record a drop that inserts that whenever a Child 44 reference is made on this show. You folks out there can call me JJ, and before we get started, you should go learn all the good stuff about this show and the Next Reel extended family of podcasts at thenextreel.com. There are cool ways to join us and our community of film fun there, so come on in, because we want to continue the conversation with you. And let's start that conversation off with your first thoughts about First Man. From our first man, Tommy Handsome.
I have a feeling, judged on critical reception, this film is pretty beloved. I guess just to keep it really short up top, for me, a few incredibly well filmed and gripping sequences does not make up for a majority of what I thought was lifeless, very cold emotion. I think it's inherent. It's tough because Neil Armstrong, apparently by definition, is one of the most reserved people I've ever seen. And under actor extraordinaire Ryan Gosling, as a result, is the perfect person to play him. But that doesn't mean that it's gripping for me. I had a lot of trouble with it.
Well, I think that's fair, and I think it's good that you have such a strong take on it, because I think, like you said, with the critical response to this right now, there's a lot of balancing that I think might need to go on as we talk about how we received it as well. So, your first thoughts, Pete. What did you think?
Insofar as I try my hardest to make every opinion that comes out of my mouth one that agrees with Tommy, I have to part ways here. And in fact, I feel quite strongly the other way. I deeply enjoyed my time with this movie. I thought Ryan Gosling was perfect. And I think his performance and the way the family performed sort of grief and the intensity with which Chazelle put us inside the family and inside the tip of this rocket and inside the suits. I think he made some incredibly good choices. And, I saw it with my 12-year-old and my 16-year-old, and I can say they were equally gripped. They walked out feeling great about this movie. And it gave us a ton to talk about. So I'm very enthusiastic about this movie.
That's
and
great.
It was a 2-hour and 20-minute awesome ride for us.
That's interesting because your 12-year-old might need to see it again in high school in history class. Anyway, but I think that's interesting too, and I'm glad we have some balance in our ranks as well. Steve, what did you think of it?
The challenge of going to a movie like this is that I have seen multiple times Apollo 13 and The Right Stuff. So this is all information that I'm, familiar with. So for me, I am looking for, are you telling me something new? What is the reason for telling this story from Neil Armstrong's point of view? So I'm looking for something interesting with this character because as you said, this is something that happened in real life. Everybody knows how it ends. So what is pulling me through? And unfortunately for me, there was nothing pulling me through this movie. It was, well, this happened, this happened, this happened, and this happened. There wasn't a lot of this happened because this needed to happen, or this has to happen because this is happening. I just felt really disconnected. I agree with Tommy. This is a very cold film. I felt, at moments there were, I don't want to say theft or stealing from, but I could see influences from, Stanley Kubrick, which again, a very cold filmmaker. But also, and I hate to say this, there were moments that felt like with the family, he was trying to steal things from Terrence Malick's Tree of Life, and it just didn't fit in to this movie. And it felt like multiple things going on that didn't really connect together for me emotionally. And when there's a story about a family, I felt like there were so many barriers between the audience and these characters that I just couldn't connect. There was no emotional resolution in the story for me.
I love what Steve just said, because while I was watching it, I had just rewatched The Tree of Life by Terrence Malick, and I just completely randomly, and I agree with Steve. I see some of the things that maybe he was trying to do in my mind. He didn't get there. I agree.
Let me just say for the record, one does not randomly watch Tree of Life.
Oh, it was on TNT and I just popped it on. It's like Shawshank Redemption. Once you start, there goes the afternoon.
Well, I appreciate all your guys' takes. For me, it was intensely dramatic. I felt that the film was intensely dramatic, but told in really questionable chunks is kind of how I felt about it. It did bring me along for the ride in some places. I actually had to check my heartbeat a couple times, but because a lot of the ways that the film was edited, it made me, while I was seemingly just sitting there watching in silence through some really interesting points of the movie, I noticed that my heart was kind of racing with it. So I think as a film, I think it's really interesting because there are a lot of really fantastically filmed segments and sequences that I think are worthy of discussion that we'll talk about. But I also had a lot of questions or problems with some of those things as well. And I bring up the high school reference for you, Pete, because what I'm going to struggle to do with this movie, I think it's a good movie. I think it's an interesting movie, but I'm going to struggle to recommend it for anyone because I really feel like it's one of those movies that I watched in high school and had value to my high school history teacher far more than it did for me as an audience member. So it's kind of a weird place for me in that because I admire a lot of what it did, but I don't know that it's a terribly enjoyable film. One place that I want to go with it is talking about the story, because that's one thing that it is a ride. And Pete, you mentioned it's 2 hours and 20 minutes long. For me, the only thing that really was a new or that was a particular story element where the book ends about it's his daughter Karen that was brought up the big end as he let's spoil it right away that of what Neil took to the moon, which I believe is new information, right? That's not something that's been widely reported in the past. It's definitely not something I knew about the moon story, that Neil Armstrong brought something up for Karen.
Well, I didn't know it, but I haven't read the book that this is based on.
There you go as well. So, but other than that, there didn't really seem to be any sort of story arc to what was going on. It felt, and I know it's a biopic. It's, it's this kind of thing that's just kind of recounting history, but it didn't feel like there was any sort of momentum to the story. So tell me more about your experience and having your kids there and what was the real sort of ride that you were on. If you can describe that as you were watching it, what was the dramatic aspect of the story for you as it grew in intensity?
Well, I think the dramatic, you're sort of following these parallel stories. One, because the film opens with such an intense flight sequence, right? And I adore this sequence. I thought it was an incredibly energetic way to get us into the film on this X-15 test flight that he was doing when he bounced off the atmosphere. And I also really appreciate the choices they made. We start to get a sense of the flavor of how they're going to use the camera. What is the voice that they're going to use to place us in and around this equipment? Well, all of these other films that I think you guys have already mentioned, these other space films, really capture well in most cases, not as well in others, but generally capture the grandeur and the romance. Even when they're intense, right? I mean, you get a lot of the, a lot of the glory of the space travel and solving space problems, but you don't get a lot of the just fear, a lot of the pulse pounding, beads of sweat on the face POV of actually being in that experience. And I think that's what we get right out of the gate with this test flight is we're in the cockpit with him. We don't even know who it is that we're with. We're so close to him. We can't see his face. We don't get a full shot of the craft until it's on the ground. And I thought that was a fantastic way to get us into the voice of the film. Then we go into this family drama. We totally change gears, and we experience them trying to solve the problem of his daughter's cancer. And we have him, the engineer, drawing all these diagrams and keeping all of these books and on the phone and trying to solve this problem. So now we have these two parallel narratives that I think actually do define a narrative arc for both the family, and we are in their family and sort of watching the evolution of their grief together through the very last shot of the film, which I think is magnificent, and also how that channels into his experience at NASA, how he uses NASA as a way to sort of escape and explore the grief that he's been experiencing in his family. So I actually felt like that was all really clear.
Yeah, and I actually agree with you on the points that you brought up. For me, objectively, that felt like the first half hour and the last 5 minutes of the film. So that's the hard part for me, is that it didn't carry me through the other segments that I felt were much more. I mean, in the word that I used to describe it, I've talked about this movie to a couple other people thus far, and they asked me, well, what's the movie like? And for me, it felt really sterile. It felt really like it was just, they were spending a lot of time on things that were just trying to tell us what happened, as opposed to the dramatic aspects of what could be in a film here.
How much of that, though, JJ, is just maybe not liking Ryan Gosling? Could that be part of it? Because I really watched that guy, and I feel like that grief was on his face in every single scene. And when we have these spikes in the narrative, spikes like when he abandons his wife at a party because he just can't handle the grief of seeing the phantom child, his phantom child playing with the other kids. Like, that wasn't in the last 5 minutes. That wasn't in the first half hour. That is a narrative point right in the middle of the film. And I just don't think you're giving it credit for those moments. I feel like you might have escaped those because of opinions about Gosling or other issues. I think they're there.
I guess that could be, but I definitely did not see the grief on Gosling's face in those moments.
Yeah, I did. I mean,
let's go straight to Gosling if you want to bring him up, because I mean, if Neil Armstrong is this stoic character, which Tommy, you brought up in your initial thoughts here, if he is that, then Ryan Gosling is the perfect cast for this person. But what the point that you're making, Pete, is that you sensed his grief about his child as he was coping with it through the film, whereas there was a lot of darkness and grief that befell this entire group. And I think that's really the message of how difficult the astronauts' journey was to get to this achievement. And I didn't get any of that from Ryan Gosling. So I think your question is warranted. Unless Neil was really as stoic as Ryan Gosling plays in most of the movies that he's in, then I didn't see it. Tommy, you mentioned that about Ryan Gosling. How did you feel about that? What do you know about Neil Armstrong and the cast here?
Well, Neil and I know very little about Neil Armstrong. I think what I do know is that he was a Boy Scout. It's sort of through and through. And yes, that means Ryan Gosling, I guess, is the perfect one to play him. But Ryan Gosling's kind of playing Neil Armstrong then in a lot of films. I feel like I think he's actually maybe a replicant after he was in that one movie.
That's my favorite movie that he's in. Yeah.
Some of his, I mean, he and Tom Hardy both are sort of interesting masters of underplaying things. Tom Hardy, though, captures my eye for some reason. Ryan Gosling, I can't even tell if he's acting sometimes. To the point that I understand, I mean, it can be dramatic to watch someone hear over the phone that 3 of his coworkers and friends just died in a horrific way, and you don't see it on his face, and then he has to. I guess what I'm saying is the screenplay has to go out of its way to make you feel what he's feeling, because he gives nothing and then he breaks the glass. he gives nothing when he sees, in my opinion, Pete, almost nothing when he sees his phantom child, and they make him storm out of a party.
I guess I'm just a Gosling fan because I see everything you say you didn't see.
Yeah.
But he's not changing his facial expression. Like, the only time he changes his facial expression is in really big scenes of, like, when he really does break down.
What's the meme? The meme that goes around of that Ryan Gosling will not eat his cereal or something like that, and they have like constantly they show scenes of Ryan Gosling
put cereal in his mouth
and trying to put something in his mouth, and he just will turn away with no change in his expression. Sorry, I think potentially he's a polarizing actor for this reason. That and that's why I think, Pete, your question does have merit. I don't know. I would assume that I'm a 50-50 person on Ryan Gosling, and I think that when it fits, it works for me. But this stuff, I really wait, there is a scene where he breaks down.
Yes.
Yeah. It's the same as in Blade Runner. It's the same as in Drive. There's this interesting thing revolving around Ryan Gosling where he's given 1 to 2 really big scenes of breaking. He does it incredibly well, but it's almost like that gives him credit or the affordability to then play the rest on what I feel is almost autopilot. I'm sure I'm wrong because he's a very respected and highly sought after actor, but I also wonder if maybe some directors like him because he's such a blank canvas.
I'm absolutely sure that's true because so much of his performance is it's so subtle and so nuanced, and it's like rice. It takes on the flavor of what's around it, right? So if you're already not in the movie, you're not going to feel for his performance. I think that's a really, I feel like that's a rational explanation for Ryan Gosling. Like, if you like the movie, you are more likely to like him. If you don't, I just feel like there is a lot of context that comes into a Gosling performance.
Steve, what's your favorite Ryan Gosling movie?
I don't know if I have a favorite Ryan Gosling movie, but I will say
we know what camp you're in then.
No, I do enjoy him, and I will say, like, Crazy Stupid Love. I love that movie. I find him very entertaining in that. This one, I hear what you're saying, Pete, and I was invested from the beginning. I agree. Great opening. And then the issue with the daughter. And then about halfway through this movie, I thought, oh my gosh, this guy has to feel cursed. Everybody around him is dying in this quest to get to the moon. And so I can see why he's closing himself off. Why, when he leaves the party, he doesn't want to deal with anybody. He's like, look, would I have left the party if I wanted to talk to anybody? No, he is a person that's, I am assuming, is an introvert that he needs to deal with his stuff on his own. And so I am fine with that. I think that carries through, and I can buy that. To me, it's not a weakness in the film. What is an issue is that with every other film, there's some type of payoff of, is there a release? Because the message I get from this movie is, well, if you're emotionally distant from your wife, just go to the moon and that will fix everything. There was no payoff to that for me. He resolved whatever his grief was with his daughter, and so then it's like he comes back and his wife's like, "Oh, everything's okay." That didn't fix it. I didn't get the sense of what he was working through to get to that point. And that's where I felt the distance became a barrier that prevented me from taking that journey with him. I am fine with him being stoic. He's got to get this job done. There's a lot of bad stuff happening around him, and he's hoping, praying to survive through this. And so when his wife chews him out for not wanting to talk to the boys, I can understand that. He doesn't want to open himself up to all this pain he's carrying around. To me, that's not the issue. It's the journey, the arc that he's supposed to take. I never get let in on that. When he shows up with that bracelet on the moon, I'm surprised. It took me so far out of the movie because I didn't know, because in minute 15 or whatever, he puts it in a drawer. We don't see it. I don't know that he's still working through that. I know he's feeling haunted because he sees her at the party, but I have no sense of that he's found a personal resolution and he's going to take that to the moon with him because he hears Buzz Aldrin's taking some of his wife's jewelry. There's nothing to let me in to his thought process of this is what I need to do. This is going to help me have some closure with this. It's just, he's there, he chunks it into the crater and we're done. And I'm like,
well, he chucks it into the crater. I like how you're right. It's like you're robbing it of everything.
Well, because I don't know what that meant for him.
Sure.
Well,
Sure.
and I do want to give the film credit for something in response to what you're saying there, Steve, and that's that they are making choices in making this film to tell the story in certain ways, and there is a lot of show and not tell. And I think that the thing that I admire about Pete's point here is that he was along for the ride for all of those intents, which we saw as, Ryan Gosling not really being intense, but when he's dealing with his grief, he's still relating to those earlier complicating incidents. And Chazelle doesn't, and the screenwriters in this case too, don't necessarily need to tell us that that's what he's dealing with for Pete. But the rest of us, and I mean, my piece about it was that there wasn't a story there for me. Everything that was happening in the middle was really just historical nature. And so what I want to do really is to talk about the way they told the stories in those points, because I think we disagree on the way that they were dealing with grief, or they deal with the sort of emotional storyline that they were doing. So if we talk about the specific things that were happening in those other parts of the film, not the first half hour, not the end 5 minutes, but we talk about all the test flights they have, all the different stresses that the astronauts are going through, we can really talk about the way that they use the camera to tell the story here. And what I'm trying to get to specifically is how much darn shaking there is in this movie.
Everywhere.
Did anyone have rumble seats in their theater?
That would have been a nightmare.
So when we're in the control room and we got shaky cam in the control room, your seats were rumbling?
Yeah, exactly. No, but the point being is that I wanted to bring up the point that they used the camera in really interesting ways to tell the story through this movie. And usually I'm in great appreciation of that. But particularly some of the shaky stuff when they were in the really tight quarters of the capsules, whether they're in test flights or in launches, focused on a lot of the pieces of the equipment and were shaking through them for what seemed to be an inordinate amount of time to me. Did that bother anyone else?
I personally loved it. I thought that it, when I said in my opening that a bunch of really sort of incredible sequences versus, for me, the rest of the film, I thought all of the flying stuff, including, especially is it not pronounced Gemini?
That is actually an interesting thing that, I was watching some making of material on this, and one of the British folks noted that at the time, he asked the question of Damien Chazelle, and at the time there was a large contingent of the population that actually pronounced it Gemini, and so it is historically accurate pronunciation.
Wow. I 100% assumed that it was historically accurate. It was just so weird. Especially I thought the movie peaked personally during that first Gemini 8, was it?
Yes. With the
Gemini 8 when he went up. Yes, that was all of that entire part of the movie is, I think, just an absolute classic. It made me feel space flight and the terror, to your point, definitely, Pete, the terror and the out of controlness of, the tininess of it. When they go in there and to have to walk into that capsule in POV, like you said, Pete, that thing is a tomb. And I just thought that was breathtakingly incredible. I loved all of that. For me, it was the shakiness and the overly close-up stuff down on the ground that I found personally distasteful. But I know we're not talking about that yet. But I loved half of the cinematography. I love what they did in the capsules.
Well, and I just want to comment on that because I think we have to take those at the same place.
Okay.
For me, walking into, you're absolutely right. Walking into the capsule and getting harnessed in, trussed in, all those close-ups of the pipe fittings and all those, and the thing screwing the door closed, especially when we hit Apollo 1, when that becomes such a horrific experience, right? Which I thought was handled well, given the tragedy.
Yeah. Scary.
Then we go home and we have the same sort of compression. The camera gives us the same sort of emotional fear and compression of his experience as, and I'm going to use the words Gosling actually says in his research on Armstrong, that he was a crushing introvert. Like he really struggled with his own introversion. And so, it was one of those things where it feels like any request, and we see more and more of that as that family narrative moves on to the big blow up when Claire Foy or Janet comes in and blows up in his office, that all of his experience in his family mirrors his experience in that capsule. It all looks like that. And to me, that parallel was so powerful. And the resolution of that fight at home, that it ends in a board meeting with his kids, I thought was so true to now what I know of this Neil Armstrong, that this is how this guy's going to handle it. Any other questions? I thought that was really strong
and tragic, right? I mean, strong and tragic.
But it's not just him. I mean, maybe part of it is just part of me doesn't maybe like Neil Armstrong that much as far as a way of me being able to connect to another person. I mean, for me, the idea of how he treats his family, how he treats his wife, how he handles certain situations is fairly distasteful. Not in. It's still filmed that way. I would have liked some feeling more of a difference when it's filmed back at home, when it's filmed, when he's not there, when he's up in the space and we're down in the rocket control or whatever that's called. I mean, it's pretty consistent. Everyone is filmed this way. It doesn't feel like it's, for a lot of time, it's his crushing introvertedness. It's everything. The entire movie is too close for me. So I'm not exactly sure if I love that idea, but I'm not sure. But maybe it would have been just too jarring to then let the film breathe a little bit. I'm not sure. But thank you for bringing that up. That's a really interesting point.
So Pete, my question would be then, and I hear what you're saying, and I can go along with that. And this is his story, so this is his sort of perspective on this, and I like that idea because we do see several times where he wants out of that house. I mean, he's a guy that's a loner. And even as you're saying that, I'm thinking, even at the end of the film, the only way he can connect with his wife is still there's a barrier between them. He is not somebody that wants people close with him. So then my question is, why? What is the reason to tell his story this way? What am I supposed to get other than what I feel that I got, which was an education on some information about, NASA and how we got to the moon? If it was about details, I wanted more technical stuff. If it was about the impact it had on Neil, I still don't buy the resolution. What was I supposed to learn about Neil? What did he learn about himself? What is his journey, his arc? Can you flesh that out for me of what going to the moon did for him? He's still an introvert. What is?
Yeah, let's be clear. Probably not to your satisfaction.
Okay, no, that's
your feeling about the
that's
movie.
Fine,
so,
but maybe you can bring me on board. But what did you feel was, if this is a story to be told, why does it need to be told? What do we as an audience, what are we supposed to take away from this? What are we supposed to get about Neil Armstrong in this?
Well, I think there are a couple of places where that comes into focus for me. And the first one is in his when he is trying out for the job. And he goes into the interview and they ask him, why should we explore space? And his answer is not the answer you would expect of a hardcore engineer introvert, right? His answer is one of an explorer and an artist. It's somebody who sees sort of more the empathetic or the empathic nature of exploration, right? I think we need to, when we've been in space, we get a different perspective, and we are constantly, as humanity, we should always be searching for new perspectives, because in this case, maybe we're going to see something that we should have seen a long time ago, but have only been able to now. And then when you tie that to the very last scene on the moon, which, first of all, I love the way they handle him getting out of the spacecraft, right? Getting out of the spacecraft when he's fighting, for me, he's fighting his instinct to, he's fighting what we have learned of him as the introvert and the engineer. Like, I'm gonna get all the data. I'm gonna slowly but surely get all the data, and then we're gonna go to that side camera, which was, where that camera was mounted, and we're gonna get that line. But then we end the narrative of Karen on the moon. And I absolutely don't see how you guys didn't see the Karen Jules coming. It floors me that I'm sitting there with my kids and all three of us were like, yeah, we totally see that coming. In fact, we saw it coming from the press conference when Aldrin said, yeah, I'm going to take some Jules up there. We look at each other and like, well, that's where the Karen thing from the drawer is going to go. It's going to go on to the moon. It felt so telegraphed and obvious that it was something we almost thought was too much, but that we actually use that to end the personal narrative on the moon, I think was a really nice bow to put on this particular story, such that when he gets back and he has the barrier between, not because he chooses to be there, not because he chooses to have a barrier down, but because he's in quarantine for a month, that he actually...
But the storyteller could have had that happen after he gets out of quarantine. The reunited with his wife, a warm embrace with the family to show him connected with his family. We could have had that same thing after quarantine.
No. You would not get the same experience. What you get in that last shot, and I wish we had a still of it, because that last shot is so powerful. It's the angle of the glass. It is so conscious of what you need to see in it. You see his face and her face in his head looking back at him from the inside, and it is the most amazing sort of wrapper that says, to us it was the experience of, hey, this woman who has been behind you is still with you, and we're going to rebuild now that you're home from the moon. This was a very difficult thing. This starts a new chapter, and all of these reflections and faces were incredibly powerful in that regard.
Claire Foy was amazing in that scene. She reported about eight or nine different emotions from the time that she walked in the door to the with just her eyes. I mean, I literally felt as though, as an audience member, that I was having a conversation with her, not knowing, but feeling the emotions from her. Of course, I had none of that from Ryan Gosling, but but that's why that was her moment. And Steve, I like what you're saying about the barrier. I think it's a good choice by the screenwriter to put it there, because I think it actually connects with Pete's narrative here of what we're talking about the introvert. That scene I like in particular for the way that you're bottling up the story. That's not the sterile, that's not the piece of the sterile parts of the film that were there. I was really happy with what we saw from Claire Foy in that moment.
I just love that she wasn't a NASA wife. In so many of these movies, you get NASA wives, and in this movie, we have
NASA wife 1, NASA wife 2, NASA wife 3.
And there were some of those in this movie. But with Claire Foy's performance, we have a woman with agency and strength at home, and we see a complex, a woman dealing with some really complex emotions. And the best scene for her, I mean, she walks into the other room and is staring kind of out the window, and her son comes in and taps her on the shoulder. Says, "What's wrong?" She said, "Nothing. Daddy's going to the moon." And he says, "Okay, can I play outside?" And that is just could not have been more perfect. Yeah, it was just great.
So we jumped ahead a little bit to the acting. I don't think we should jump over Damien Chazelle so quickly. This is a really interesting movie for him, considering what he's directed, what's in his list. What do you think is behind the choice for him to make this? And I saw his fingers in it. I saw the direction.
For the listener, do you want to talk about his filmography?
Specifically, my favorite film that he's done is Whiplash. That was kind of a transformative movie for me about jazz music, and it was actually an Oscar nominee in the year that I think Birdman won. Is that right? Going back,
yes.
And then most recently, he was he's well known for La La Land, and there was some connection I see here. I think Pete, you wrote that he had already connected with Ryan Gosling about First Man before he began work on La La Land. So they've been working on this for a while. So this movie is definitely different than those in terms of the reasons for making it and what you're trying to bring forth with this historical piece. What things did you see?
Well, it's different in one key way, JJ, and that is that the protagonist does not enter a jazz club in the third act only to find a prominent figure from his past playing a piano on stage. So that's different from both of those prior movies, which I think is worth noting.
I think they cut that scene, Pete.
But of course, Whiplash and this movie do have in common, of course, someone willing to sacrifice even their own well-being and their health and everything in order to try to be the
That's right.
absolute
And
best.
mine was a
something.
joke, and that is
So-
credit to Jack Ballaghan on Letterboxd, which is not even my joke. I totally stole it. But yours is a really good point, and I think that is one of the ways, JJ, to your point, that you see Damien Chazelle's fingers in this. He is a guy who is clearly has this, if not overtly on his mind. Clearly, he's working through some things with the properties that he's working on.
Right. Yeah, and I hadn't thought of it that way. That makes sense. And it's interesting that, he and
I think Damien's got some daddy issues.
That's true. But what I was talking about more from a finger standpoint is really the artful
Yeah.
nature of the film, because in both those films, in Whiplash and La La Land, you see a lot of creative ways of storytelling that you might not see in other films. I know that, the La La Land is famous for the goof for Best Picture, being announced previous to Moonlight in its Oscar run. But in both cases, they were both nominated for Best Picture, and they both were really powerhouses of art in that they were still delivering a real sort of quality piece of film. And I think that this movie is somewhat that way too. And I saw that in this movie. I saw choices that Chazelle was making about the way he wanted to tell the story that were done in a more artful way. I liked that throughout the film, even though some of those choices didn't always hit with me.
Yeah, I agree. I think he's very talented. There are some amazing sequences in this film. And as Tommy brought up the whole Gemini 8, that to me is one of those classic sequences that everybody's going to remember of that. There are some great moments. To me, that's one of the pieces I could track with Neil of going back to the beginning of doubts about him from that first test flight bouncing off the atmosphere. It's like, is there something distracting him? And there's questions about his capacity to really do this. And there's things that go wrong. We have that great sequence there. There's things that work really well. The shaky cam may have been too much in some places, but to me, it really put me in the room. Emotionally, I may have been distant, but I think in terms of a lot of the camera work, there were a lot of pieces that worked very well for me. A lot of the way some shots were framed, I thought this works really well. To Pete's point, yes, I agree. That final shot, beautiful. Does it work for the story? And I wonder if there was some more work needed on the script, at least in my opinion. He did the best with what he was, dealt with there. But I think visually, did an amazing job of creating something that's very in the moment. It didn't feel like a Hollywood, glossy version. It felt really gritty and brought me in there. And I think even those close-ups of like rivets, things like that, really put me in the place there. Physically, emotionally, I think there may have been some work needed on the script, and I can't blame him for that. So again, it's not my. If I have to rank Damien Chazelle's work, this is not going to be the top of my list. But I think, again, he's showing something different. This is not a musical. His first two films, a lot of focus on music. There is music present in this film, but I see that he's sort of stretching his legs a little bit and venturing into some new territory. So I'm continuing to want to watch where he goes with his career, because I think he's a very talented filmmaker, and looking forward to where he goes next. For me, the stumble, I think, falls more to the script than to him.
Well, and now you bring up script. I think that you and I are just going to have to agree to disagree on shaky rivets and their value. But beyond that, there's a difference too. When we look at, we say that this is a little bit different content-wise. I like the through line that you're making, Tommy, about the nature of the stories in these films for Chazelle. But we look at Josh Singer's background. He's the scriptwriter here, and this is very sort of well-trod terrain for him in terms of historical screenplays, in that he has written Spotlight and The Post, and was a writer on The West Wing. So yeah, I mean, this is very, very, very natural place for him to be in this realm. Pete, you say that this really felt like a Josh Singer script to you?
Yeah, I feel like the same way. I feel like the film has Damien Chazelle's fingers on it. I think this feels like a Josh Singer script. He was also he was a producer and in the writer's room for Lie to Me and Fringe, and you get almost even more of that sort of and Law and Order, I should add, is another one that's in his catalog of work. And so you get even more of that kind of procedural stuff that you get in the NASA side of things, that non-romantic kind of dirty procedural stuff in things like Law and Order and Fringe, and much more of the process, the kind of cold, when Coach Taylor shows up. Every time Coach Taylor shows up, you're going to get a little bit more of that cold delivery and that cold sort of West Wing political vibe. I think I can kind of feel his pulse there. So I like it.
That's interesting that he is a TV guy, because this film, for as long as it is also cut to the quick.
Right.
Like there's very little air and things. You show up right when the scene is starting and you leave as soon as it's over. Like I don't remember like a
there's no
were there like establishing shots. I feel like I was just thrown into buildings. Like, here's what you gotta go now, get out of here. And then I was thrown into the thing of like, he's sad about his daughter, not necessarily in a bad way, but it was like, here, you've got what you need, move on. There's too much time, there's too much to go, which is kind of refreshing. I could have personally used a little bit of air, but maybe that's just because I wasn't ready for to use your perfect word, Pete, is the crushing feeling of this entire movie. Everything, I felt like I was in the front row, and I was not in the front row. I was in the middle of the theater, but the entire thing just sort of shoved me right in its face. There's a really good chance. Well, no, I'll save that for the end, but I'm having good thoughts about this movie as we're going. I'm feeling better about it.
The one place where I felt they tried establishing shots, and again, this wasn't consistent with the rest of the film, was when we first arrive at the moon. There is one shot that's kind of a long pan that creates the moon's visible. It makes the moon visible as flat, and it's a long pan with nothing in it except for the moon's surface in the lower third of the camera. That was one of those choices that I didn't agree with, because it didn't have to do with the story. If it were an establishing shot, a true establishing shot, then it would connect to the next thing that we're going to see. But the nature of the film was not one of establishing shots. It was that kind of slam you into the scene sort of thing. So when it showed up, I expected to see something that was connected to what we were doing. It was the arrival of the moon as a character in this story. And choices like that, again, while artistic, and it was beautiful to look at on screen. It was those kind of things those choices were very interesting to choose, but it didn't work in context of what I was watching for the story.
That is the first time really that the camera calmed down. Almost as if by design. Pete, I might be coming your way a little bit, but one thing that I do remember sticking out so much about the moon sequence was after that really slow pan right, then the front on looking directly at his reflective
visor,
moon suit visor. No, I think it's called a moon suit.
This isn't a Marvel movie, it's freaking NASA.
It's all Marvel, Pete. What shocked me so much of that, what I found, something really sort of took me aback, and it was because obviously he made the camera disappear in an impossible way, which has happened a lot before, but it was because I had been so conscious of the camera throughout the entire movie. There's no getting lost in this. There's a certain way of like handheld or jiggly camera that makes it seem a little bit more fly on the wall, a little bit more realistic. This was
more 1960s.
Maybe this, I mean, for a lot of the shaky camera, not in the space scenes, but in the normal scenes, was so aggressive. I was always just like, I'm watching a movie. But then to have that sort of calmness that really stuck out for me, because
it's the opposite for me, because I think the shaky cam puts me like a documentary right there in the living room or in the control room. And then I'm on the moon looking at Neil Armstrong. And then I am going to do this slow 360 pan that is from whose point of view? Nobody. It's just a camera that's turning on the surface of the moon slowly and coming back around. And I thought, this isn't from Neil's point of view. If it had been Neil's point of view, I'm surveying this, which would make sense to me. But the fact that it starts on him and comes around to him, I'm like, what are we seeing? It's the camera showing us what he's seeing, but it's not, because, as you point out, we're looking right into his visor and we're not seeing the camera. So who are we? This is Damien Chazelle telling us and showing us something, and it took me out of it because, again, it was so different from everything else. And I thought, why are you doing this? Again, you're not giving me insight into Neil. which I kept hoping for, but you're showing me something calm, but why? And I'm still struggling to put all the pieces together to give me some sense of what does Damien Chazelle want me to know, understand, and feel at the end of this movie, and I still don't know what it is.
Fair enough. Just because we're on that sequence, did anyone else? I'm sure it's just me. I didn't know that you could lift up the reflective sort of gold cover part, and there's still more helmet under that. When he put his hands up, I was like, Neil, what are you doing? Oh, got it. He's just getting a different view. Like, why would I think that like this movie was like? And then he took off his helmet, and that's how we learned that air's on the moon.
Putting the gold visor up is the equivalent of putting your sunglasses on the top of your head, and then he put him back down.
Yeah, and giving things like a little thumbs up. But my heart raced out of my chest for 3 seconds. Then I was like, "Oh my god, I might be the opposite of an astronaut." I'm so.
You actually thought it was La La Land for a second. That's hilarious. We talked a little bit about some performances already. This film is littered with a lot of interesting character actors, other than some of the people we talked about. Someone already brought up Coach Taylor. That's Kyle Chandler from Friday Night Lights. Is that right? Mm-hmm. I think his name should actually be Deke Slayton.
Yeah.
I know he's playing a character named Deke Slayton, but that person should be called Deke Slayton, Mr. Kyle Chandler, just so you know. I like seeing him. I think he's just entirely likable in everything he does. What are some of the other performances that you saw, some of those other character actors that showed up that you may recognize, but maybe not in their period piece attire? Who did you like in this movie?
Well, I got to go back to Buzz Aldrin,
yes.
Corey Stoll, because I think he sort of steals the end of the movie. I think his character is super funny, and that he's missing that kind of frontal lobe thing that makes you stop when the words come to your mouth. It makes you say, "Hey,
he operates.
I should not say this thing that I want to say right." And he does it every scene he's in.
He's like a 4-year-old. There's no internal filter. Just thought comes across right out the mouth. Way to go, Buzz.
Exactly. And Buzz Aldrin is such a hero in the canon of NASA, right?
Yes.
I mean, Buzz freaking Aldrin. And they suck all of that heroism out in this movie. And finally, in the end of the movie, when he shakes his hand and they leave, he's a gentleman again. He's not a hero. He's not emasculated. He's just a gentleman. And I thought that was actually really nice. And I think Corey Stoll, for playing those kinds of characters, he is a guy that is firmly in his wheelhouse. And so I think he did a great job with this, ultimately a small part. But I think he did great.
Well, and if you look at in history, if these guys, if these are maybe caricatures of what Neil and Buzz's personalities were really like, or if they're just sort of expressions of it, they actually make a really good team because they complement each other. And I think that's expressed by the press conference where they're asked, "You're going to go down in history. What does that mean for you if this is successful?" And Neil chooses to answer, "We expect this flight to be successful," right? In his introverted, very stoic sort of thing.
Great answer for NASA, terrible answer for the press.
For the world. So then immediately Buzz steps in and then answers, "Well, let me tell you what I feel about, history and legend." Like, it's interesting that he's a foil and played in the negative in most of the movie. And I really appreciate you bringing up, Pete, the fact that they redeem his character in the way that probably is appropriate for this mission in our history, and that they probably were a fantastic team as they went through all these different astronauts as they're living and dying and struggling and aiming to be this person. They chose a really great pair to send up there together to make this happen. And I think the way that those two actors played that off, if it's accurate, it was perfect.
I struggle with that because to me, I guess it's, again, I'm thinking about other movies, and I think about Apollo 13, where Gary Sinise gets sick, and it's like, this totally could jeopardize the mission because this team, they need to anticipate each other's moves. They've got to be in each other's heads. They've got to have this ultimate trust. And when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin get in there, I'm like, these are two guys that just barely tolerate each other. And they are going to be shooting off in this rocket to the moon. And what I have in the story is these guys don't really care for each other. And there's a huge gap between them versus Apollo 13 creating this cohesive team that can function and read each other's minds. And here it's just two guys in a big metal can going to the moon. I hope they can make it because I don't know that these guys even trust each other. For me, it made it really difficult for me to know what's the reality of, I've got two different films telling me two different stories about what it takes to have a successful mission. Is it that just these two guys, their own individual expertise and their differences, you can still have a successful mission? Or is it they really need to be dependent on each other? And it's two different stories, two different messages. And I guess, again, it comes back to
source material.
I don't have a, source
this
material.
Movie
and
is
what
from
am I
the
supposed
book
to learn?
About Neil Armstrong. So this is Neil Armstrong's story. Apollo 13.
Which is, also highly technical.
Right. And exactly. Right. So of course it's from that side. And then now Apollo 13 was Jim Lovell's account. So that's where you go there. And then if you go back, I don't remember much about the right stuff, but they all come from different sources. That's based on the book of Tom Wolfe, this historical account of this kind of thing. So I think it's good to bring up, but I think if we look at, all of these astronauts have a story to tell, I think it'll be interesting when we see another perspective of what it takes to make a good team.
So much of this movie is about removing the romance and the aspirational part of the work.
Sure.
And in this movie,
the Neil Armstrong
guys
story.
they go home and they feed their kids, and maybe they spend some time with their wives, and then they go to work. And when they go to work, it's a job, and it's not glorified. And to me, I watch this, and I watch these guys having to work together because individually they are exceptional in some area or areas, and then they're thrust together as a team, and they have to just figure it out. It may be aspirational in Apollo 13 to say, oh, these guys have to anticipate all their options, but also it's a job, and they go to work. And I think what Chazelle is trying to showcase here is it's not like that. Like, it's like you go to work at your office. Some people are on your team and your boss says you really need to work it out and be a great, anticipate everybody's needs and good to great and rah, rah, rah. But you know what? It's a job, and some people are just not cool. And you have to figure out how to work with them too. I get that out of this movie, and I really love it. Again, sucking the romance out of this and just saying why it's distilling the reason we go to the moon. And I think we have a couple of these awesome moments that punctuate this, that demonstrate why this movie exists, why even the cold, introverted engineer says we should go to the moon. It's worth it. There's value in human cost.
So does it show us that?
Yes.
Does it show us
yes, around every
payoff
turn
is
it
of
shows
going
us
to the moon?
this. Oh,
No,
Steve,
it doesn't.
see it again.
shows Neil can
killing
reconcile
me.
with his wife. What do we see differently? What do we as Americans see differently? What does Neil see differently? He's purged of the grief of the death of his daughter. I don't see that he sees his family, his coworkers, anything differently than before.
Anything
he
I
left.
say here is repeating
He's
what
now
I've
able-
said before. I can't make the case any better, Steve. I honestly I can't. It's not. Yeah, I've got nothing
Okay.
else.
All right.
One other way that they told the story really well in this movie was through music. I was super happy with all of the music cues throughout this movie. Well, I shouldn't say all, because I'm going to actually bring up ones that I didn't like. But in particular, when they got into space and they had the last piece of the rocket break off or go away, you had a sort of wall of sound moment that was potentially, for me, which this is going to sound odd considering the story points we brought up, but potentially was one of the most emotional points of the film for me, is taking that time and music and adding it there. In general, in the way that we talked about Chazelle and the camera, we're going to get to cinematography as well, but telling part of the story, I think they used music in this movie to tell the story in a way that rivals some of the filmmakers we were talking about before, really in a good way. Now, that being said, also as it swelled and got more and more intense through the moon landing, I kept reminding myself that there was no music when Neil and Buzz were landing on the moon. What musical moments did you guys notice when you were watching this movie?
Anywhere that there was a theremin.
What is that? I don't know what that is.
It's an instrument that doesn't physically exist.
It doesn't. It's like an energy. It's like you're interacting with essentially, I think, an electrical wave that generates a tone,
Yeah.
and it is the Star Trek original motion picture theme. That was a theremin, and in fact, the theremin is featured in the song that Buzz or that Neil and his wife dance to, and so that made.
And wasn't that called A Walk on the Moon? Wasn't the name of
like
that, the name of that song?
And so the theremin is actually used in Justin Hurwitz went back and incorporated into some of the major themes, and I thought it was really nice. Yeah,
I love it.
I will say, as I said, I think I said in my first comments, there's sort of a Kubrickian moment when they're docking on the Gemini 8 mission, and they're docking, and we've got that music playing. It to me, it worked well there. It was sort of a callback to a reaching toward 2001 where we've got ships sort of floating in space and we've got, classical music playing. That worked really well for me. It was one thing where I said, yes, this feels right. This feels good. I'm enjoying this. So that's one that I thought stood out for me as a memorable moment.
Well, and I think all of us mentioned in our initial comments that there were some really beautifully filmed sequences in here. We should actually call out the cinematographer, the DP, Linus Sandgren, making his impact felt in this movie. I felt that there was really artful storytelling done here. There were camera tricks that were being used that I loved because it actually made me feel like I was flipping over directions in the theater when really they could have been just spinning the camera. There were some things that I was confused about, though. Did you guys know what was archival footage and what was actually shot to make look like archival footage? Could you tell in what you saw?
I could only tell at times because of the quality of the film, which was also difficult because he seemingly used a lot of different.
He did different film
stock throughout. It definitely changed as it went, but some of the actual space stuff, it just didn't look. You could see the crackles and the little, I don't know what they're called, but where there's scratches. Yeah. In the film.
Well, one shot in particular I was really frustrated with, and it might be just because it's archival. It's tough to know, but when the launch to the moon takes off and they start with the wide shot of just the smoke, and then the camera searches for it up, and then it catches a bit of the rocket, but then it holds there and starts panning, and then it repeats, then moves up, and it does that twice or three times. And it's a flub, right? It's a mistake. It's something with the camera that's likely locked off and then having to adjust after the rocket is adjusting its movement. That, I mean, if it's a choice to make it look, that's a really weird thing. I couldn't tell whether that was old footage or whether that was real. Do you guys know?
I don't think any of that is archival. I think everything in the everything that was shot in
that
the
actual
capsule,
launch stuff, right.
That was all miniature stuff. And if you watch the behind the scenes, I mean, you can see how they did it. They have this giant 3-story LCD screen, this wraparound screen. Okay. So it's all shot in camera, and the backgrounds are Earth, like the NASA Earth, and it's the clouds, and it's skyscape and cityscape for the rockets, and they put the rocket in front of this giant screen. It's fantastic how they did it.
But then I really don't like that.
I think I get what
that
he was
mistake
going for.
Really bothers me from a camera perspective, because there's no reason to. I mean, unless you're trying to make it look amateur.
I think they were. I think he was absolutely trying to make it look amateur, because if you see, but there is definitely a precedent. I mean, ever since, I'm sure way earlier than this, but the TV show Battlestar Galactica, the idea of using cameras and using their fallibility in a completely controlled environment. There was no space. There were no cameras in Battlestar Galactica, the TV show, but it would constantly be trying to catch up to things. Like a snap zoom and then miss it and then go. And if you watch a lot of early TV footage of those launches, they weren't great.
Yeah.
Well, there's that, and then there's the when in the first scene when Neil first lands out at Edwards Air Force Base, and they give us the first sort of place and time set, and we're in an aerial or it looks like an aerial coming on to the crash scene, and the camera is literally, I mean, just all over the place with the words on the screen. I mean, that's a pet peeve of mine anyway. So if you're choosing to do that to make it look bad on purpose, I just question the logic behind that. If so, you're going too far for me from a camera perspective.
For me, the idea of not being able to gracefully follow a rocket when it's launching, if you're able to completely gracefully follow it in perfect frame, I think you're robbing it of its power. Because this is a monumental achievement, and this is ridiculous. We took a huge amount of fuel and rockets and strapped it to the bottom of a tin can. To be able to just sort of be able to gracefully follow that up, I think takes away from, it's just a series of enormous, horrible explosions. And so to not be able to follow that, I think that actually gives it a little bit more like, yikes, there's not even a way to like really capture this moment because it's just too much power.
That's
for
a
me.
good point, but it launched so slowly. Anyway, I don't need to nitpick it. I think you're right, but it was too much for me. They were trying
Sure.
to be too authentic, and instead it looked like it was just errors on purpose. So yeah, I totally hear what you're saying.
I will say the costumes and production design I thought was really quite nice. And, obviously the NASA stuff, they have a lot of, a lot of blueprint to follow, right? They have the standards and can rebuild so many of the features of NASA and mission control and the spacesuits and all that stuff. But I still think even with a rich instruction set that I have to imagine that they had, it all looked really good. Like it felt very real in the space. So I enjoyed it quite a bit. Credit to Nathan Crowley, production design, and Mary Zoffrey's leading costumes.
The person that I saw the movie with was disappointed that Jan's hair didn't change over the course of 7 years. Didn't seem very accurate for the 60s.
I'm disappointed that they didn't get Tom Hanks to play Jim Lovell. I thought that would have been awesome.
Do a nice youthful recreation.
This maybe belongs more in final thoughts, but as I alluded to before, this conversation has not turned me around about this movie, but it has definitely hugely opened the door of this might be another You're Next for me. In that that horror movie that I very hugely panned when we reviewed it, and now I'm a huge fan of. There's a really good chance that this movie that I went in with a certain type of feeling of what it should be, and it wasn't that, but it was so incredibly strong and consistent in its vision that now that I know what it is, there's a really good chance that I will rewatch this movie and find a huge amount of more appreciation for it. And this conversation is part of that. Yeah.
That's awesome. I don't think it's changed for me in that I guess I see the value in the film, and I was always looking to give it a big rating and a like. I just don't know how to tell people to go see this movie. Talking about the aspect that this seems like a movie that I would have watched in high school. It really does. It sounds like talking about the history class thing. This is what we would have watched after Glory, this kind of thing. So.
Bowled over by Pete, you saying that your kids loved it, because I would have thought that kids would have been bored, silly, and then wake up, and then bored, silly. So that actually gives it a lot more life for me.
Yeah.
If your kids, that's good to know. Because JJ, why I said that, is I agree with you. Is one of the first things that I thought about when someone asked me how it was. I said it was long. And that's a terrible.
I said sterile. I think it's time. I think it's time for us to rank this.
First man to take a walk on the moon seemed like a cursed plan. If we go up too soon, a lunar crash land. Gossing so deadpan, we must decide our own divide together, men. We must defend our rank for first man.
Very
like
nice.
Hamilton.
Like Hamilton.
I'm the Hamilton of the film board. Weird.
Check the entire Film Board filmography ranked at flickchart.com/TNR Filmboard. When you get there, you can create a tournament-style stack ranking of your own and see how your big screen proclivities compare to ours. Who's got the keys to the kingdom? Where do we start? First Man versus...
I'm in it. First Man versus The Mummy.
First Man.
See, this is hard because I already said, I think I'm going to look... No, I guess I have to rank it as I feel now.
Sure.
Right?
Yes.
Right.
You can do First Man versus The Mummy. Come on.
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Weird. The Mummy.
Really?
Oh.
Remember, I was the one that liked The Mummy.
Yeah.
Remember?
That's gonna be a...
No, this
you
is...
all immediately hate me a little bit more. Oh, right.
Like the movie. No. This is First Man. I will say there are... Yeah, I didn't...
All right, and First Man for me, too. First Man versus Fury.
First Man.
Fury.
Oh, Fury. The tank one?
Yeah.
Yes, Fury.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think it's Fury for me, too.
All right. I'll just take all my votes.
Yeah,
And
he pulled out his own tooth.
oh, yeah, that's right.
All right.
Yeah.
First Man versus Ant-Man.
Abstain?
Oh, Ant-Man.
I'm going to say Ant-Man as well.
All right. Well, it's First
Ant-Man's
Man
aged
for
very
me,
well with
but
me.
okay. First Man versus Snowden Man.
First Man.
Abstain?
God, it is so First Man for me.
Really?
It's First Man
So
so
First Man.
hard.
All
Me
right.
too.
Fine. Whatever. Go ahead.
Oh, nuts. First Man versus Captain America Winter Soldier.
First Man.
Winter Soldier.
Winter Soldier.
Winter
for me.
Soldier.
Congratulations. First Man is now number 32 on our flick
Oh.
chart. It comes just after Avengers Age of Ultron, which weirdly we didn't
Okay.
get to rate it against, and just before Snowden. So Well done.
Interesting.
I curiously
32 out of what? What's the total number?
74.
Okay.
It's right in the middle.
All right,
I think that's a little low.
Slightly above halfway. Yeah.
It is, I will say, we have, you collectively, according to this ranking, have said that First Man is better than The Dark Tower. Would you agree with that?
Appropriately, yes.
Good. All right. Hey,
Yes.
Flick chart works.
Yeah.
How about first?
So, and the way that I've been talking about it, even though that I didn't, I had problems with it or I wasn't too energized by it, I still think it's like a 4-star movie for me and a like. I just don't know how, Tommy, you say you're going to see it again. I don't think I will. And I don't know who to say to go to send to it. So
yeah, if you're going by the algorithm for letterbox.com/the next reel, what is your star?
4
4
stars and a like.
I would like to give it, my name is Tommy, and I would like to give it a 3 right down the middle because there's a good chance I'm going to change that to a 4 in the hypothetical future.
And do you give it a like or no like? A heart or no heart? Does your heart bleed for this one?
Right now? Yeah, no, like. There was enough that was, I already said was a Stone Cold Classics.
All
yes, absolutely like.
Tommy Hart and Steve.
Yeah, Stone Cold. Correct. See, my algorithm. I don't like the algorithm because it's too cold and calculating, and it needs to. So I'm gonna go with 2 stars. My algorithm says I should only give it a half a star, but I think it is worth 2 stars. There are some sequences that do redeem this, but I'm giving it 2 stars and a no, not
All
like
right.
right
Well,
now.
I give it
it's
a hardcore 5 stars and a heart. And that means
wow.
that our
Oh, boy.
average is 3.5 stars with a heart.
And we are all over the place. Which
Yeah.
is
C
really
plus,
interesting.
C plus. That algorithm, it's really the Gosling of algorithms. I agree, Steve.
Yes, it is.
And I think you could say
Love
the
that
same
guy.
thing about Neil Armstrong. He is kind of the Gosling of astronauts after this movie.
Yeah.
Right.
So what's next? Where do we go from here? We talked about it and thinking about November. November's a really interesting month, and we are kind of got our eyes on this interesting movie called The Favorite, spelled in the European way with a Favourite. That's by Yorgos Lanthimos, which is a kind of favorite of us from the Trailer Rewind days. He did The Lobster. So we've got our eyes on that, but it's only opening limited. So we may be doing that Thanksgiving weekend, or we may be looking for a backup that's got a more wide release. And there's a lot of good movies coming out in November. Bohemian Rhapsody, a bunch of things that are going to hit. So look for more information from the Film Board about that. Pete, you and Andy on the Mothership Show. What are you guys doing? What series are you in right now?
Well, as of right now, we just released our episode on last Thursday on Night of the Living Dead, 1968. We're still
Nice.
celebrating the films of
Yay!
1968. And yes, Night of the Living Dead's a big favorite between us. And this week, that's right, Dawn of the Dead, 1978. It's exactly 10 years later, but 3 weeks in time. And we pick up at a mall. And I'm
Oh, that one is
Yes,
dynamite.
yeah.
Yes.
dynamite. I'm
Did
very
you guys
excited
put
about
these
it.
in October because it's October?
I
and
don't.
the
I
whole
don't.
holiday?
I don't speak to any of that production scheduling. That's all
You're
Andy.
so darn
He's
smart.
super smart about that.
I love
he
it.
sees around corners. He's amazing.
Yeah. Give Andy some kudos.
That's
on that.
right.
And if you didn't catch it when we mentioned it earlier, we are all having loads of fun over on Discord. We gather with folks about a half an hour before every Film Board show to chat a bit about how much the movie shook us in the right or wrong direction. Go to thenextreel.com for details on how you can connect with us in that virtual green room. Thank you all so much for listening. We are looking forward to the next one. Say goodnight, Pete Wright.
Good night, Pete Wright.
See you soon, Tommy Handsome.
See you soon, Tommy Hansen.
One more word from Steve Sarmento.
Hondo.
Yeah! At the next reel, when the movie ends, our conversation begins. Till next.
We did it!